Now, here in Nigeria, the government and organized labor will reconvene their negotiations to finalize decisions on appropriate pricing of petrol and electricity tariff by middle of April. Our sister outfit, This Day Newspapers, is reporting that as part of moves to resolve the contentious issue of the appropriate pricing for petrol, the federal government has been consulting others with a view to building a consensus on the matter. Last week, the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, NNPC, had lamented what it described as the heavy financial burden it was being made to bear in bearing the extra cost of petrol due to the differential in the landing cost and pump price of the commodity, owing to the rising cost of crude oil in the international market. It said that the current 165 naira pump price was no longer feasible, adding that the actual price should be 212 or above. Let's deepen the discussion now as Tengi George-Ikoli, Program Coordinator, Nigerian National Resource Charter, is at our Abuja studio. And from Port Harcourt, we have Ankyo Briggs, environmental activist, who joins us. Tengi, let's start with you. I have here something I read up from last year, and I want to quote from you. You said that the Nigerian National Resource Charter, that's the NNRC, called on the federal government to immediately privatize the country's moribund refineries and also sell off its unviable oil assets so as to be able to cushion the economy from the vagaries of the global economic slowdown occasioned by the novel coronavirus pandemic. So this was the advice you gave almost a year ago, April last year. What's your reaction to the rehabilitation of the Port Harcourt refinery for $1.5 billion?
Okay, thank you so much for that. I will say that the reason why we had made that suggestion, a recommendation in March 2020, was recognizing that the government had attempted to deregulate in the past times, but it's not always been successful, and that's because you didn't have a strong enough sustainability plan in place. And so we foresaw this happening if certain elements and certain things had not been put in place. One of those things was what you had just read out. That was our first recommendation. We had a number of other things around that as well. One was saying to privatize, because we have seen that the government has made different attempts in running different outfits and have not been as successful. We've seen the NLNG example, we've seen the telecoms example, and in those areas you've had private sector playing a very pivotal role. And so it was our advice that to be successful, we expected that the government would explore all those other options in terms of selling off, potentially still retaining a very significant stake, as it has done with LNG, but allowing the private sector to run so that it could be, our assets could be run efficiently to deliver as much returns as possible for the Nigerian government and for the Nigerian coffers, which then benefits us all as Nigerians. So
you haven't sort of tagged on, what's your reaction to the rehabilitation of the Port Harcourt refinery? It seems to go against your recommendations.
In terms of that option, my question would be, have we considered the options around selling it, around privatizing it? Why did we come up with this particular example? Why is this the choice that we're taking? We have other refineries. This is just one refinery, and it only deals with 200 thousand of our deposits out of the 450. What are we doing in terms of the other refineries? What are our considerations? What elements came into making this specific decision? So there are still a lot of questions around why we chose to go down this path. Again, because the government has not proven to be very successful when it has attempted to take on this sort of projects. I would say that potentially, why are we not considering the other options? Why are we not considering privatizing and selling?
Well, let's bring in Ankyo Briggs into the conversation. Ankyo, thank you so much for joining us. What side of the divide are you? There have been diverse reactions to this rehabilitation of the Port Harcourt refinery. Have we got our priorities right? Ankyo Briggs? Okay, we seem to be having a problem with that connection with Ankyo Briggs. So let me bring it back to you, Tengi, in the moment. So how can we truly deregulate the downstream sector, with the local refineries not performing, not working, functioning at a loss, as some would describe it. And of course, without the passage of the Petroleum Industry Bill, can we really say we're ready to deregulate the downstream sector?
Okay, just again going to what you had read initially, the NNRC had put together a consortium of interested parties, stakeholders who had looked at this particular issue and figuring out how can we deregulate the downstream sector. We noted that one of the things that we would need would be to try and get a level playing field in the sector, so where you have NNPC and the other players having access to the same forex terms, and then also ensuring that you're able to have the laws and the policies in place to support deregulation. So even though the policy was already introduced by the government initially, we didn't have the requisite laws. For instance, you have a PPRA, a PEF that operates to actually contribute to keeping that regulation, the status quo in place. The Petroleum Industry Bill sought to repeal those specific areas. It was going to repeal the PPRA Act, was going to repeal the PEF Act. It was also going to repeal the Price Control Act. But you have that PIB still being stalled despite a lot of conversations around passing that bill. That was even done during that period in April last year. We're promised that the bill will be passed in June. We promised that it will be passed in December, and we're promised it will be passed in April, but we haven't yet seen that happen. So we need those laws actually passed. The government did take a step in terms of the regulations that PPRA put out in June 2020, where they had stated that they were going to provide a guiding price, so an indicative price essentially, letting Nigerians know what the price should be when you look at all the different elements, all the different cost elements, landing cost, freight costs, storage costs, all those costs. So what you had expected to see was to have PPRA produce a consistent guiding price that would then have Nigerians have an understanding of what things were, because there was a concern that if Nigerians don't understand what the real prices were potentially, you would have marketers imposing their own prices, and then you having Nigerians being taken for a ride. So that is what that was supposed to have been done. It was supposed to have been consistent, but PPRA stopped at some point, and that is what that publication of the PPRA templates around the 212 price that had been put out, that had everybody confused and surprised, which is why we had the backlash, and Nigerians were confused and reacted as they did because of that confusion.
Okay.
And now, what the question that I would ask would be, where we didn't have a budget for subsidy in the 2021 budget, where is the cost, where is the payment coming from? The NNPC is now claiming that it has to be paid in 100 to 120 billion monthly, when that wasn't budgeted for. Is that sounds akin to the under recovery that we heard about years ago, in terms of NNPC taking it directly at source. That then leaves a reduced amount that then goes to the Nigerian coffers, which then gets to other sectors, like health sectors, which is what we're relying on now to even resolve a COVID-19 pandemic crisis.
Okay, thank you so much for interrogating these issues. But if I'm right, you're an advocate of liberalizing the downstream sector and allowing the market forces to determine the pump price. But I want you to break it down for the man in the streets and explain, in terms of solutions, two things. Why the rise in oil price does not rather translate to a better economic situation for us nationally, and therefore possibly reduced prices of petrol at the pump. And then secondly, why liberalizing the market and removing subsidy is in the people's best interest, since as far as they're concerned, it immediately translates to a higher price of petrol, higher cost of transport, and higher cost of food, because people who sell food say that that also affects their prices as well. So try and break this down for the man in the streets. Why is this good news?
Okay. Where you liberalize the downstream sector, that allows for efficiencies You saw last year where the federal government had some discussions with Labour and were able to reduce a 5 naira cost from the cost of petrol. Why was that the case? That was because there were efficiencies. But the question we would ask is why weren't those efficiencies translated to Nigerians in the first place? So what that allows you is looking across the whole value chain. You would have efficiencies across the value chain that again gets translated to Nigerians. That's on the one hand. In terms of the increase in prices, for instance, like I said, we don't have a budget for subsidy. So where there's a misconception that because there's subsidy payments and that gets to you directly, essentially what it is that they're taking the money from somewhere else. So this could go to other sectors of the economy, but instead it's being taken away and then siphoned to put into subsidy, which gets only paid to a certain amount of people and doesn't necessarily get to Nigerian people as well. So in terms of the subsidy that we currently have, if you have high prices, that is essentially liberalizing the sector and having those funds be channeled to other things that can directly impact Nigerians. It can potentially be put into transportation, it can be put into electricity tariffs, or wherever direct benefits that Nigerians can actually accrue and can actually get it. And so that's one of the things that we're advocating for.
And let's flip this coin. On the side of the government, attempts at subsidy removal has remained a chaotic failure. Why do you think this is so?
One of the issues appears to be in terms of lack of communication and lack of transparency. The government had put this in place. One of the things that we had advocated for initially was to keep Nigerians informed of what the policies and practices were, of what we would need to get to food regulation and what that would mean for Nigerians. Unfortunately, that process was started, but it wasn't continued on. And so that's what has brought the confusion, as I stated earlier on. So it's essentially making sure Nigerians are carried along. So when PPRA produced that guiding price, for instance, if that had been done consistently since the announcement was made in June 2020, Nigerians would have been carried along and there would have been no confusion. And that's one of the things that we had noted earlier on. We had noted that one of the things that Nigerians always have to react to, or Nigerians will react to, when they're surprised, when they're not carried along. So there's a dearth of communication for Nigerians in terms of what deregulation means for them and how they can get it and how they can get the benefits alternatively. There was some good attempt made earlier on. I would even say PPRA had actually agreed with the consortium and engaged with us in terms of engaging Nigerians, but that was only done on a one-off time. But I would say if we're moving forward now, that we should make sure that we're able to do this in a way that is very transparent and clear for Nigerians. But I will say as well that we don't actually have the funds to put into these sorts of subsidy right now. That is a huge receipt. Nigeria, we have a huge debt. We saw last year when the receipts from oil reduced that we had to slash our budgets, and so we're unable to fund our budgets, and then we had to increase our debt and our borrowing. So that's how these things will translate to costing for Nigerians as well. And the receipts from the oil exploitation is actually where we're able to fund those debts and to be able to pay back our debts. So this is sort of how it translates and the trajectory around that. Okay,
I would assume that a lot of your advocacy is presumed upon a more transparent and maybe accountable system. But then why would anyone expect that when you're saying that even the money that we are taking as subsidy is coming from like ghost accounts, for lack of a better word, and is being shunted from other portfolios? So please briefly tell us.
It's not ghost accounts though.
Okay. No, but that tells you that there's no transparency.
The monies are not coming from ghost accounts.
Okay. Go on.
Okay, no, I'm not saying those ghost accounts. Again, the question is, where is it coming from? We don't know if it's ghost accounts. I don't want to be definitive and say it's ghost accounts. I'm not there.
Yes.
But again, that's that question, is where is it coming from specifically? Again, we've had under recovery. That, again, assumes lack of transparency because all the funds that are getting from the government, that got in as NNPC, acting as a stakeholder for Nigerians, is supposed to go to the FAC. But if it's not going there and it's deducted as source, who is the oversight? Who is responsible for oversight?
Okay, Tengi, it looks like
said anything to ask questions in terms of how you're making those sort of decisions.
Thank you, Tengi. More questions than we can answer in this segment. Thank you for your time.